Hey everyone, this is your orientation video for week 3. My son Judah just walked in and decided to join us for as long as he'll handle. And want to start out by just telling you again that I thought we had a great set of discussions in week 2, and I think got some really important questions on the table, some of which I want to highlight in this video. So, one of the byproducts that I think many of you are beginning to realize and point out in your posts of studying the Gospel of Matthew carefully is the destabilization of some of the common terms of our language. So you come to the Gospel of Matthew with perhaps relatively settled meanings of words and concepts like politics, power, religion, economics, things like this, and then find that the story of Matthew troubles those meanings, troubles those concepts. And many of you are just doing a really thoughtful job, I think, allowing the story to at least trouble, question the terms of your analysis. And that is going to continue across the expanse of the story of Matthew. And part of the purpose of that, I hope you're beginning to realize, is to actually reform our speech. So our own ways of talking are to be affected by the way the words work in Matthew. What we mean by justice, what we mean by peace, these kinds of terms need to be used in a way that is faithful to their usage in the Gospel of Matthew. So, part of our task here is to grow in our own patterns of speech through the way that words mean what they mean in the course of the Gospel about Jesus according to Matthew. As several of you pointed out, one of the key terms that is already coming up, I think, for many of us, and certainly one that I'm emphasizing in my own interpretation of Matthew, that I'm commending to you and trying to sort of start conversations with, is the term politics or political power. And this is, I think, an important term because there is a tendency that some of you have recognized already in some of the commentators to minimize any possible sort of political meaning of Jesus' life. Something about that seems to threaten the integrity of Christian commitments, maybe fitting some understandable concern that we have about our spirituality or God's revelation being soiled with politics. But we can't avoid the obvious political meaning of Jesus's life thus far, the sort of struggles that his life has already caught up in, without attending to the political nature of them, even if that ends up challenging what we have assumed political to mean. So that's just one example. I appreciate many of you pointing out that the way that Jesus pursues peace is not something that has a sort of easy definition of peace. Peacemaking, it turns out, is a very subtle art, shall we say, by the light of Jesus' life. And so we have to allow the story to teach us the complexities of the nature of peacemaking and what Jesus means when he says, "Blessed be the peacemakers." So continue to uh, bring the terms of your own formation to the story. We can't help but do that, but do your best to allow the story to trouble those terms, to question them, perhaps to reform them. And as I think our conversation is showing, nobody has a monopoly on what any of these words means, including me. Uh, it's of immense benefit for us to listen to one another, to hear what each other is hearing the text to say, and so to develop our understanding of what the words of the story mean by listening to the way that it sounds to each other. So I appreciate the way that our discussions in the forums, I think, are helping us to grow in our understanding of what the story is saying by listening to how different people in our class are interpreting it. You want to go, buddy? Yeah? So, can you shut that door so Marley doesn't bark too loud? Let him outside. That would be our dog, and that means my wife is home. I'm going to try to keep going here because I don't actually know how to pause this video very well. So the way that the terms are being shaped, the meaning of the words of Matthew to this point in the story, the Son of God, the kingdom of God, who the Messiah is, what the visions of the prophets mean, this is going to be key for the way that we read these next 3 chapters, the Sermon on the Mount. It's difficult, as you can imagine, to read the Sermon on the Mount because, or to read it well, I should say, because we tend to come to it with certain topics already defined for ourselves. And the result is that we don't really allow the narrative to shape the way that we read Jesus' first public address, which he gives to his disciples in the hearing of these crowds that have been flocking to him as the one now carrying the mantle of the kingdom of heaven after John the Baptist has been arrested. So you're going to see in the work that I have for you this week a lot of emphasis on how the narrative as we're studying it frames the Sermon on the Mount and what that framing does to the meaning of Jesus' teaching in that sermon. So do your best to pay attention to that framing and then to allow it to maybe question some of the typical interpretations, perhaps, that you've had of the famous Sermon on the Mount. You're going to have 2 choices for working through it. Obviously, you've got your 2 commentators and some secondary literature, some articles that I have for you as well. But in terms of what you're going to hear from me for the Sermon on the Mount, you're going to have 2 choices. One is to work through something pretty similar to what you've heard the past couple of weeks, which would be a kind of podcast with me trying to work through the sermon chunk by chunk, clarifying what it means, defending to some extent my interpretations, but also just trying to stimulate your thinking and some conversation among us. The second option will be to read something that I've written on the Sermon on the Mount. And what it is a sample chapter that I've written for a forthcoming commentary on the Gospel of Matthew. And I'm trying to do something a little bit different than what you often find in commentaries these days. Something that has a lot of literary sensibility, but also some practical punch, sense of currency about it. And I'm trying to pull that off not in 2 movements, what the text once meant, what it now means, but in 1 movement, what these words say to us from God. So that's the second option, and you'll be able to work through either one of those or both if you want. There will be a lot of overlap, but you can do whatever's most convenient for you or what you prefer. And I look forward to your responses to what I've come up with on the Sermon on the Mount. Last issue just to bring up here is you've gotten a taste, I think, of the pattern of study that I want to pursue broadly across the Gospel of Matthew, with me identifying, this is my daughter Amaya.
Hi.
Identifying
Talking to
my class. This is a video for my class. Identifying key sort of points in a stretch of the narrative where you've got a chance to make some influential interpretive judgments. That might be the presence of an Old Testament quotation or allusion. It might mean trying to sort of analyze, understand the relationship between one scene and the next. So I gave you 9 study questions last time for you to study 2 of. You'll have something similar with the Sermon on the Mount. The reason I'm bringing that up, though, is that this is also trying to prepare you for your first assignment, more formal assignment for this class, the interpretive working paper that's not going to be due until week 7, but that you'll get the instructions for in week 5. And the sorts of questions that you see in those forums that I'm giving you as options to choose from, those are the sorts of questions that I expect to appear in your working paper. If you do a working paper on a passage that we have already studied in the class, you can use the questions from the work that we've done for that week in the response forum. But I also want you to be working at developing some of your own. I obviously am not exhausting all of the acute points of tension where you're going to be able to exercise some important interpretive judgment in the work that I'm giving you. So I also mean for those to be samples, those questions, for you to develop your own as you focus your own interpretive powers on one particular passage, especially attending to the way that that passage is framed by the narrative. So, thanks again for your hard work. I hope you haven't forgotten some of the thematic concerns that I have for this class. You remember I mentioned them in the first introductory video for the whole class. They have to do with recovering the biblical Israelite context of Matthew, also with reading Matthew as a narrative, learning how to interpret the words of Matthew according to their narrative presentation, and finally, reading the story in a way that respects its life, the fact that it's alive, that if we interpret it well, it is pressing upon us, calling to us, inviting us into a life that God has made possible for us, called Christian discipleship. So I continue to be concerned about those 3 considerations, and I just want to remind you of them here as we dive into what is a very familiar passage in the Bible, or sermon in the Bible, if you want to call it a sermon on the Mount, but which perhaps has suffered in the way that it's been read from not paying adequate attention to the Israelite context, the Israelite biblical background of its words, hasn't read it according to its narrative presentation, and has been apt sometimes to confine it, sort of lock it in some past utopia of Jesus's life or something, as opposed to reading it as God's living word, making Jesus present to us, calling to us in our very own context today. Thanks again for your hard work. Look forward to this week of study with you.